Let's see here. A little bit over there, yeah. Wait a minute. I don't even have any crystal terrain. I know. What if we make a lot of crystal terrain and send half over to Brent in America? Hey good folks, man it feels great to be back. My name is Leif and I want to welcome you to my YouTube channel called Devs and Dice. Today I'm going to show to you how I created these nice crystal scatter terrain pieces. Before we kick this one off, I want to thank you all for the continued support. Work has calmed down ever so slightly, so I hope to be posting on a bit more regular cadence. Subscribe to the channel to make sure that you don't miss any of the coming videos. With that out of the way, let's get cracking. As usual, we're gonna start out by bringing out the Proxxon Hotwire Foam Cutter. For the beginning, I'm gonna use a straight jig. Now this part is really just about getting the rough shape in. So as you can see, I'm cutting a whole bunch of, well, I guess you would call it rectangles or elongated rectangles. Now once I had a whole bunch of those, I switched to using this angle cutter from Shifting Lands. Gerard sent me this a while back and it's really a good jig to use for things like this. Now with this, it enabled me to quite easily cut out a more octagon shape, but not only that, I could also make a more organic octagonal shape, which was ideal for all of the crystals. As you can see, the shape looks quite amazing in my opinion. The cuts are straight, but when it came to the actual top and sort of making those facets, I found it much easier with a handheld foam cutter. This way I could also get some organic feel to the actual tip of the crystals. Here you can see all of those wonderful crystals all lined up in a row. I have to say this didn't take all that long time, it was probably 1 or 2 evenings of work, but man oh man, did I cause a mess. Now looking at the actual XPS foam, unfortunately this was some old foam I've had a long time ago and it's not a very dense foam. So I figured best to Mod Podge it, and here I'm actually not diluting the Mod Podge, and I'm doing that specifically so I can try to hide the actual grain of the XPS foam as much as possible. Now lately my wife has been buying quite a lot of kitchen utensils, and she bought me this awesome baking plate which was perfect for letting crystals dry. Meanwhile this was happening, I was also printing out some resin crystals that I made myself with my wonderful Elegoo Mars 2 Pro, which I love so much. So far all of this has been quite obvious and straightforward, but now it came time to actually paint the crystals. So I did some YouTube searching, and one of the better videos I found out there was Wylock's video. You can check it out over here. For my crystals, I tried to analyze and see what crystals actually looked like, and try to come up with a simplified process that enabled me to paint all of my 124 crystals. Step 1. Priming. Now it might seem quite obvious, but the primer I'm using is actually Panzer Grey. I didn't want to go full black. The reason for this will become more apparent going forward, but I just made sure that all of the crystals had a solid coat of Panzer Grey. Now you can see here, SpellPro sent me these 108 mushrooms, and I figured I would choose the most weird looking mushrooms, and I'm going to use these to decorate the bases later on. So might as well give these a prime while we're at it. As a terrain maker, I really love these sort of kits of mushrooms and skulls. They're awesome to decorate your bases and your terrain projects. Now, as you can see, there was at this point quite a lot of different dark gray crystals and mushrooms on my table. Step 2. Value sketch. For this, I'm going to utilize some white opaque ink. And the idea really here is that I want to treat each facet of a crystal individually. Each facet is brightest at the bottom and then fades up to that panzer gray. Now I'm using an airbrush. You can use stippling. This will, however, take longer time most likely, and the result will probably not be as smooth. So if you have an airbrush, I recommend it. Step 3. Color filter. Now comes the time when we're gonna punch some saturated colors onto the crystals. For me, I chose 2 inks, turquoise and magenta. So pretty much I split up the crystals half-half, and as you can see, I'm trying to come in evenly using the airbrush and ideally make it 2 thin coats than 1 humongously thick coat, because this is inks and they will run away from you. I also use a little bit of airbrush medium just to make sure that, at least in my experience, it feels like the ink actually adheres better. Here you can see the magenta and you can really see what really intense color pop both of these colors have. Step 4. Soft highlights. Now, we have previously defined the light, or so we thought. What we're really defining is actually, I would say, the saturation of the inks. Now it's time to reinforce that light. So I'm using Army Painter's airbrush colors, and the first one is Fey Pink. For the turquoise ones, I'm actually coming in with Hydra High Turquoise. That you saw there was actually one of the early prototypes that Army Painter sent me. Now, similar to what we did before, we want to make the crystals brighter at the bottom of each facet. But in addition to that, I want each edge to have a shine to it. So a very careful airbrushing alongside each edge. And you can really at this step start to see the crystal slowly taking shape. Step 5. Edge highlighting. Now, in the previous steps, we did some soft highlighting. Now it's time to come in with that hard highlight. For this, I'm using Army Painter's Toxic Mist for the turquoise crystals. For this job, I also prefer a wider flat brush, because the edges are quite defined and it simply enables you to paint more and not have to fill up your brush with paint all of the time. Now, for the magenta crystals, I'm actually coming in with Centaur Skin, which looking at the color itself, that felt like a good option. Once all of the edge highlighting was done, it was time to gloss varnish them. Step 6. Basing. In order to make these as durable as possible, I chose to go with, I'm not sure if this is MDF or heavy chipboard, to be honest. It's 3mm thick and you can cut it. As you can see, I recommend you cutting it at an angle. It simply cuts easier. That being said, this was just the beginning, so I had to go out in the middle of the night and use my Dremel to smoothen out the edges. Now, once I had these bases all done, I really thought long and hard about what was the next step, because it wasn't as easy as it usually is. But I wanted to start with a black coat, just normal craft paint. Now, the reason why I'm so thoughtful of what the next step is because the crystals are already done, and I knew I wanted to make some sort of special basing that looked good. The next step for the crystals was to use a hot wire foam cutter just to cut them at an angle and make them have that more organic feel to them. Once I dry fitted all of them, it was a quite easy task of just hot gluing down all of the crystals bit by bit. And as you can see, my bases, I've sort of structured these to large ones, medium ones, and small ones. That being said, each and every one of these formations will contain crystals of different sizes just to get a more organic feel again. Once all of the crystals were glued down to their bases, it was time to cut some of these awesome mushrooms from Spellcrow. Now you can see that I painted these very simply with some yellow ochre and some red undershading. I felt like the color needed to be different than anything I had on the crystals, so I went with this color combination, which I think looked quite nice in the end. Once all of the mushrooms were cut, it was a simple thing just to glue them down using some super glue. Now if you're using these mushrooms, the smallest ones are actually quite small, so it's a little bit testing to get them correctly attached, but using some tweezers and skill, that actually was quite easy. At the end of this project, I am going to flock the bases, and for this I'm just using some cheap white glue because I'm going to use a bunch of it, and I'm going to come in with some rocks that I actually have. I think I bought them at IKEA, to be honest. Go figure, Swede buying terrain stuff from IKEA. These rocks actually are for decorative purposes for flowers and such, and I had them in 2 different sizes, and the good thing was that all of the rocks were actually black, which suited my sort of vision of the Underdark. Now in order to make all of this look a little bit more earthy, I came in with battlefield dressing from Army Painter. Now I've shown this before, but one thing that you want to do is to lock all of these stones down, and you do that by using some IPA alcohol and then come in with some diluted white glue water. The alcohol removes the surface tensions and makes sure that that diluted water and glue seeps into every nook and cranny. Now, once it had dried, I came in with my homemade black wash just to darken the base ever so slightly. And once that had dried, here comes the reason why I wanted the bases to be so dark. Of course, these crystals are glowing, so I'm coming back in with some Hydra Turquoise to do a dry brush just to get some OSL. Now the toxic mist that I used previously, I'm going to use that as a sort of brighter highlight, and I'm doing this at the closest parts of the crystals where they obviously would glow the most. For the magenta crystals I do the same thing, but of course the paints differ. For me I used centaur skin and pixie pink as the equivalent colors for the magenta crystals. When that was done, I took a trip to my local friendly game store, Alpha Spel, and I got some of these weird looking tufts from Gamer's Grass. I'm not sure whenever I'm gonna be using these again, but they came in very, very stark colors, but they fit with the bases here. And at this point, I think it's time to have a look at the final result. Alright folks, so if you're still with me, I want to take this opportunity to thank you so much for watching. At this moment, half of the crystals that you saw are being sent overseas to Brent in the US. I really hope he likes them. Now, if you like the video and the project, please consider clicking that like button. It's a small click for you, but it helps out the channel quite a lot. On that note, I want to thank my patrons for having patience and for supporting me over the past weeks. As normal, a special shout out goes to my champion and legend level patrons. 4VXP, Madners, Magnus Solberg, Rosen Graveyard, Leander, and Niklas Sweden Lind. Thank you so much, good folks. You are amazing. I hope you all have a nice day, stay safe, and I will see you in the next video.